E benvenuti a questa settima Alan Kruger Lecture. Questa mattina a un incontro una persona
This morning, someone told me, well, I have been to all the 20th editions of the Festival of Economics that are held in Turin. So you should really have a prize, an award to give to those who are really loyal to the Festival of Economics. And I think this title Alan Kruger would have received because he gave an essential contribution to the festival with the 7 lectures that were set an example for those who followed him in intervening to the festival. It's a lesson of medicine, of merit, because Alan Kruger has always tried to transfer difficult ideas. For example, those that were connected to Obamacare, very, very complex, or to choices that are to be made in the educational field that can really transfer this complexity with a simple language. And in the merit, I always think that all his work has always been focused around collecting data and developing economical policies based on data. He also spoke about credibility revolution. Many countries we started to analyze in deep information and taking the information that in our country, for example, in our country, are not based on data, and they're mostly based on intuitions. So the first 6 lectures, Alan Kruger lectures, were held by Hilary Olmix, by Josh Angrist, by David Card, by Enrico Moretti, by Alan Manning, and the last one by Janet Carring. And today we are very happy to have here with us ALEXANDRE MAS. During the previous lectures, were held by colleagues and co-authors of Alan Kruger who work with him, who wrote important papers, who wrote important documents within documents. Today we are changing the transition. Alex Mas was a student of Alan Kruger, and I think he greatly took a lot of benefits from the messages, from the lectures, from everything that Alan has been able to transfer to him. Alex's career is extraordinary, a career that also a very important one, not only as a scholar and academic. He has published many documents on the main international magazines, but he has had an active role in the management of policies. He was chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. He has worked at the Direction of Labor Studies within the U.S. presidencies. He worked with a tight contact with the U.S. management. So his career, as academic career of frontier research, at very advanced research, but at the same time with the constant contact with the real problems and the possibility of conditioning public policies. He's very young. He graduated, obtained his PhD 20 years ago. Now, today he's going to talk about a very important problem. So how can we evaluate how can we measure what cannot be measured? You will think the usual economists that are obsessed with measurements, but it's very, very important to measure, to give a dimension, because thanks to the capability of measuring that we can make objective evaluations in complex phenomena. You will listen to his lecture. This attempt on reaching these measures is very, very important in making actual choices. So I don't want to take time. His lecture will last 40 minutes, and then you will have the opportunity to make questions. Alex, the floor is yours.
I'm going to try to stand with apologies for the people in the front row. First of all, thank you. I am very honored to be here today, and I'm, as Tito said, I'm very especially honored to be in a lecture named after Alan Kruger, who, as you know, was my advisor and then later co-author and colleague. Alan loved to tell stories about his travels, and his times at the Festival of Economics, then at Trento, were a highlight. I would go beyond that and say, based on the frequency of his stories and his friendship with Tito, it may have been the highlight of his stories. So it is wonderful to be here today. I think I need to have my slides up. Okay. So as you know, Alan was deeply involved in policymaking, and therefore it is appropriate that today I will be talking about a fundamental problem in policymaking where economists bring insight. And in its very abstract form, this problem is how to assign and quantify prices in activities and goods that are not traded in the market. This feels and sounds very abstract, and I could try to explain that further, but I think the value of this is much easier explained in concretely. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 3 case studies, and each of them highlight a dimension of the problem and how these types of things are quantified and then used. My first 2 case studies are an homage to Torino because they involve vehicles. And I'm well aware that Torino is the heart of auto manufacturing in Italy, and in fact, these 2 case studies will be quite relevant for that. Like Alan, I spent time in government in various roles, and in one of my roles, I helped evaluate the costs and the benefits of regulation. So I want to start by just talking about one regulation which we looked at, which was the mandate to put rear view cameras in vehicles. That's now standard. Back then it was not standard. It was somewhat unusual. And the benefit of this is quite obvious, right? It's for safety purposes. However, at the time the technology was not as developed as it is now, and the analyses that were done revealed fairly significant costs. So at the time that we were looking at this regulation, I'm simplifying things a lot for this purpose, but more or less this is what it is. It was projected to cost $2 billion per year. But let me just pause for a second. My slides are in Italian. I don't speak or read Italian. So this is actually very good discipline for me because nobody likes to have speakers just read off their slides. So I cannot read off my slides, but that may be for the worse as well. So. So it was projected to cost $2 billion per year. And the benefit, there are a few benefits, but the main benefit was that it was projected to save 100 lives per year. Now we have a comparison which is difficult. We have one quantity that's in dollars and one quantity which is in people. How do we make that comparison? How do we know whether this is too big relative to that or vice versa? Well, dividing this by this, if we pass the regulation, we are implicitly saying that we value a life saved by $20 million. Now, it may seem unpleasant to determine whether or not to pass a regulation based on some threshold valuation of what a life is worth. And maybe we shouldn't do that. But the problem is these regulations are being done anyways. And when they are done, if this calculation is not done, it's being done implicitly in some form. Somebody is making that decision, whether or not they're being transparent about it. And so there's two ways we can do it. We can either be explicit about it and evaluate it carefully, or we can let some unknown bureaucrat somewhere make this determination based on their own objectives. And as an economist, I advocate transparency. Now, it is not an easy problem, and so I want to go through and describe how one might go about it. So first thing I just want to say is in looking at these numbers, you might say, well, of course we should do it. It's obvious. But what if the numbers were a little different? What if it was not $2 billion a year, but $200 billion a year, right? And then the cost per life saved would have been $2 billion. And you might say, well, we should still do it. At some point, we're going to hit a limit where it just becomes clear it's too expensive. The line has to be drawn somewhere. And the fact is there's limited scarce resources in the world, and we have to choose carefully how to use those resources. And if we put forward a regulation that is too expensive for what it achieves, we're missing opportunities elsewhere. So how do I get a value of life? I could go to the street and ask people, just say, hey, how much is your life worth or somebody else's life worth? And I'll get probably nonsensical answers. They'll say infinite, or who knows what I'll get. It's not a reliable method. We could calculate lifetime earnings and say the value of life is lifetime earnings. That doesn't seem like a very fair approach either. Are we saying that rich people are worth more than poor people? Or somebody who's retired, is their life worth nothing? That doesn't seem like a very good approach either. So what we do in economics is we look at people's revealed choices, in this case over risk, and we use those revealed choices to back out what is their implied valuation over the risk, in this case, of death. And these choices will be high-stakes, real choices. For example, where to work or where to live. Let me show you this graph that paints the picture. Imagine people making decisions on where to work. Now, different occupations have different levels of risk. Construction is riskier than, say, being an actuary. If people care about risk, they will demand more compensation to be in riskier occupations. The amount of compensation that they demand is a reflection of their preferences. And if we can estimate the market equilibrium for this trade-off between risk and earnings, that is the market quantification of risk. It's not so easy, because as you know, people sort into occupations for many different reasons. It depends not just on preferences for risk, but also their skill, their interests, and so on. So behind the scenes, there is sophisticated econometric work that seeks to control for as many other relevant factors as possible to then distill the relationship between the risk of fatality on the job and earnings, holding constant as many other things as possible. This graph shows you a scatter plot of workplace risk and earnings for occupations after all of these things have already been controlled for. So it's controlling for as much as possible to make it I don't want to use the word causal because there's always hidden factors, but controlling for as many other differences between occupations as possible. And each dot here represents an occupation. The context for this paper is in Brazil. The reason for Brazil is the data are very good there, both for, especially for workplace risk. The x-axis is the fatality rate in the occupation per 1,000 workers. And the y-axis are earnings in a logarithmic scale. And you can see that there is a positive relationship, which accords with one's intuition, maybe, that riskier occupations have to compensate workers for that additional risk. And because this is market-determined prices, we can use this relationship as what the market compensates for risk. Okay. So how do we go from a value of risk to a value of life? And when I say value of life, I want to be very clear. I mean a statistical value of life. This is not a kind of a moral sense, right? It's a statistical value of life. Well, a relationship like the one I just showed you, there's been many analyses done. A kind of typical number that you might see would say that people are willing to accept 9,000 fewer dollars to reduce the risk of death on the job by 1/1,000. Okay, so let's just take that as a given. We've estimated that, and that's a reflection of people's preferences. That's a more well-posed number than just asking somebody, what's life worth? Now imagine a community of 1,000 people. And in this community, everybody's preferences are like in this first point. And they are presented with an investment, which is you can contribute $9,000 to reduce the risk of death in your community by 1/1,000. If they have these preferences, like in point 1, they will accept that investment. Then, as a whole, the community has paid $9 million. That's 9,000 times 1,000, 9,000 times 1,000. And on average, they will have saved one life. In this way, we say that this society, this community, has put a value of saving one life at $9 million. Okay? And that's how we go from risk to a per-person value of life. This number is fairly representative of what has been found in the US and other countries, though it varies based on real data. So going back to this regulation, well, 100 lives saved implies $20 million. Oh no, our calculation says $9 million is the statistical value of life. Should we not pass the regulation? Well, in our case, when we worked on it, it was a little bit more complicated. First of all, for every fatality, there were injuries that had to be quantified. But even more importantly, the cost. We looked at this in 2010. The cost, technology was improving rapidly, and so when it eventually passed in 2014, the cost had come down considerably from $2 billion. I think that the regulation itself probably advanced when rear-view cameras would have been installed by maybe a couple of years. Right? Had we done nothing, maybe they would have been uniform by 2016. We mandated it in 2014. That 2-year difference is meaningful because the private benefits of these cameras probably made it feasible by 2016, but those private benefits don't incorporate lives saved, And that calculation made it so that it was worth implementing earlier, given costs. I want to give you a couple quick examples of other places where you might see these kind of trade-offs. This is like a bad memory. I'm sure you all remember COVID and the restrictions, especially in Italy. In the US, it's been calculated by Chad Jones that all the measures taken to prevent the spread of COVID reduced GDP by about 4%. Then we can ask the question, was that an effective way of essentially society paid for that? Was that worth it? Well, we can use this concept of cost per life saved and do some calculations. So, for example, using the figure of the $9 million per life, the $9 million value of life figure, it would have been worth it if this policies had saved 100,000 lives. Okay? So if 100,000 lives were saved because of the measures, that would have essentially broken even with a 4% reduction in GDP. Most estimates in the US, although it's very uncertain and very unclear, put the number of lives saved as much higher because the measures created a bridge to the vaccine. So a lower end estimate from the literature would be more like 800,000 lives saved, which would have put the cost per life saved at about $1 million, which is an order of magnitude lower than what our best estimates are on the statistical value of life. You can go through all the regulations that have been done, and in the US, the regulation that has been the most effective, or one of the most effective, so I don't want to be so absolute, in terms of cost effectiveness, was child-proof lighters. This is the value of this kind of analysis. We want to maximize efficiency, we want to maximize benefit given cost. Child-proof lighters turned out to be fairly cheap to implement and saved lives. And the relevant number there was about $100,000 per life saved. So several orders of magnitude less than these statistical value of life measures. I want to do case study number 2. And this is what are called the Euro 7 emission standards that are currently being debated and are going to be implemented in the EU. These emission standards regulate vehicles. And as you can see from this article, they have been somewhat controversial. In this article, Germany has indicated that they have some concerns, primarily with the cost. What do these policies do? These emission standards have replaced what are called the Euro 6 emission standards, which have traditionally regulated emissions from gasoline and diesel. The Euro 7 maintains those standards and adds one more element, which is it regulates the pollution and dust that comes out of tire and brake wear, which turns out to be quite relevant. That creates particulates, and these particulates are very fine, and they're unhealthy to breathe. So the cost of this policy has been hotly debated. The EU report implementing this gave it a cost per vehicle of about 140 to 200 euros per vehicle. If that's all transferred to the consumer, then that's how much the price of a car will increase after the Euro 7 emission standards. Industry estimates are substantially higher. They're saying 2,000 euros per vehicle. The difference, as you can see from these paragraphs, stems from this being kind of the direct cost of fabrication of manufacturing for the parts, whereas these larger estimates from industry use accept the argument that it will require a re-engineering of production lines, and also incurring large fixed costs that will have to be spread over a shrinking base of cars. I don't have any position on where the true number is in this range. So I just present you the range, and there is uncertainty. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about the benefit of the policy specifically for Torino. But actually, give me a second. So before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of a theory. So what we're going to face is a situation just like the one before, where we're going to have a well-defined cost number and a benefit that is in different units. The benefit is reduction in particulates, which we have to compare to these cost numbers that range from 120 to 2,000 euros per vehicle. And once again, we face the challenge of how do we translate a reduction in particulates to a dollar figure in terms of what people are willing to pay to have cleaner air. And just like the previous example, we're going to rely on the choices that people make. This time, the choices are going to be over residential location. When people choose neighborhoods or choose cities, they're making choices in a variety of dimensions. One of the dimensions is the quality of the air. And so what economic studies have done is they have quantified the relationship between air quality and housing values. Now, the benefits of better air are, there's a multitude of benefits. It's not just the risk of fatality, but it's also just general health, just quality of life, just a cleaner, not having to wipe the dust off your car. All of those things are benefits of cleaner air. And the beauty of looking at housing prices is that housing prices capture the full benefit. They capture everything that is better about having cleaner air because people are willing to pay more money to live in a cleaner area. Now, just like the occupational example, it's complicated because people don't just choose to live in an area based on whether it's clean or not. There's many factors. So what's been done in the literature is they use natural experiments. So they'll look at a neighborhood and they'll look at regulation over air quality and say this neighborhood saw an improvement in air quality due to regulation compared to a neighborhood that did not see an improvement. Now let's look at changes in housing values, such that the only change that we can attribute to that change in housing values is air quality. This graph here is representative of what's been found, which is generally a negative relationship between pollution and housing prices. The x-axis is what's called PM 2.5 concentration. This is particulates that are 2.5 micrometers in diameter or less, and the concentration is the micrograms of these particles per cubic meter. So higher means more particulates in the air, and you can see that this is like before, a processed relationship that has controlled for many other factors. You can see that it has a negative relationship with housing values. And this bullet point down here gives effectively a summary, maybe let's call it a median value of what this relationship has been found to be in the literature. So on average, for a 1 microgram per cubic meter increase in particulates in the air, housing prices fall by about 1%. So we're going to use this number to then apply it to expected reductions in air quality to then assign the monetary benefit that's of society to better air, which can then be compared to the costs. And I'm going to do this in the context of Torino. it's actually an interesting place to look at it because Torino, as you know, sits in a basin and has, because of its geography, has higher than average emissions that remain in this basin. And so a policy like Euro 7 could potentially be quite valuable in that it would reduce this higher than baseline level of pollution. So I just ran, this is just some arithmetic. So this is now we're in the world of me jotting down numbers on a napkin. This is not EU studies or anything like that. But in my arithmetic, based on looking at existing numbers, the baseline level of particulates in the air in Torino from 2021 to 2024 is about 20 microgram per cubic meters on average. The EU studies that justify the regulation would imply about a 4.5% reduction in particulates in the air. So then, behind the scenes, I did some calculations. Let me just talk through the calculations. Take this 4.5% reduction and apply it to this number, which is the dollar equivalent to a reduction in particulates, which is to say, how much are people willing to pay to have a 4.5% reduction in particulates? Then I multiply that number by the number of households in Torino, and then I divide that number by the number of vehicles in Torino. All this is a little rough. And I come up with this figure over here, which is that this 4.5% reduction in particulates, based on these estimates that relate willingness to pay for particulates, would be valued at about 1,300 euros per vehicle in Torino. Now we have a direct way of assessing whether for Torino this policy is cost effective or not, because the cost figures, let's assume that those all get transferred to the price of cars. So if you take the EU estimates, that'll increase the price of cars by 120 euros. This is easily cost effective. The benefits of having cleaner air in Torino far exceed that extra price in the car. If you take the industry estimates of 2,000 euro increase, then that's no longer the case. Now, there's an additional dimension, which is very relevant here, which I'm silent on, I have nothing to say about, which is that, of course, in Torino, there's the local economic impact from having auto manufacturing here. That by itself would weigh in also, because these policies will certainly have an impact on industry. So I have nothing to say about that. The last case study is in a very different direction. And this is an area I've worked on extensively. It's on how people value workplace flexibility and the quality of work. And the way I want to present this is through a few, let's call it open questions, meaning that unresolved questions that I will pose, and I actually don't have an answer for you today, so, but we can think about it. So first of all, from a policy perspective, this is quite relevant. In Italy, for example, there is legislation and policies around smart working, which regulates these smart work type of jobs. Let's think about it in the same terms that we thought about it before. These smart work jobs are going to have a benefit for some people. They're going to benefit workers. But they may, although it's an open question, they may have some cost to employers. How would we even know whether these policies have benefits that exceed costs? These types of policies are all over. In the UK, there's a recent bill to boost, which is called to boost productivity, but really what it does is it provides employment stability. And employment stability is going to be valued by the workforce. Again, possibly weighed against the cost to employers. Again, these are things that trade-offs that have to be evaluated. Without quantification, it's not possible. So to quantify how workers value these practices, I'm going to take a different approach than what I talked about before. And what we do is well, actually, I'm sorry, I have one more slide here. This is my open question. if you compare the US and Italy, there's going to be fundamental differences in the nature of work and the quality of work. It's complicated. So in Italy, it's going to be quite heterogeneous. So for older workers, work is going to be much more stable, or it's going to be more stable than in the US. More job security, probably more consistent hours. Noting that for younger workers, that's surely not the case. In Italy, younger workers, I think, translate through many temporary jobs, and so instability is the norm there. But that's also a relevant fact. In the US, we can expect that there is both instability and also hours that are sometimes irregular, employer determined, or can exceed 40 hours. Now let's compare that to this third observation. In the US, by my calculation, wages for full-time workers, after accounting for cost of living differences, are about 15% higher than in Italy. But now, having noted that the nature of work is quite different, this 15% gap may not reflect the true value of work, right? The true value of work has to be seen as every aspect of work that people value, both meaning of work, flexibility, stress, and compensation. So it's possible, this is my open question, that the overall value of work difference between the US and Italy may be smaller than what we guess from the 15% difference in wages. Okay, so now I want to show you the methodology. How would we even get at this? So unlike the previous cases, the approach is going to be a little different. What we tend to do is we ask workers to make choices. If you've ever worked in marketing, this is going to look like what's called a conjoint survey. So I'm going to go to a worker and say, or I'm going to go to a person and say, look at these two jobs, job A and job B. Now these jobs are going to differ in a number of dimensions. They have different physical demands, different levels of independence, crucially different pay. And they're going to look at these two jobs and say, well, I might enjoy a job that has less physical demand. On the other hand, that pays worse. They're going to make some evaluation over those jobs. And then they have to give you a decision. I like job A or I like job B. Okay. So then we go out and ask people over and over, different people. And we vary these characteristics, and we vary the pay differences. And so every person, we're getting a ton of variation in what we're showing them here and what we're showing them here. And by looking at choices, we can then back out what are people's willingness to pay for these different features of work. And so the concept of price here, of willingness, is how much are people willing to accept to have a better feature of work? How much are people willing to pay in lower earnings to work from home? Okay? And that is the price they're paying for this feature of work. And it's, again, to go back to the beginning, it's something that's not traded on the market. It has no market price. But by looking at these comparisons, we can calculate one. So this is a few findings from the literature. These are from my own papers. In this paper, we embedded this kind of survey where people make choices within an application process of a call center. People were applying, and we gave people options. You can work in this arrangement, like working from home or not working from home. You can work with irregular hours or regular hours, and so on. And then for each of those dimensions, we varied how much is the relative pay. And then we tracked choices. And then following the logic from the previous slide, we then were able to calculate for these actual job applicants what was their implied willingness to pay to, for example, work from home, which we found to be on average 8%. The average worker was willing to accept 8% lower wages to have the option to work from home. Even more extreme, they were willing to accept 21% lower wages for stable hours relative to hours which were determined by the employer. That's to say the employer could just tell you when to work. Clearly, people cared about that. The other finding was there was a lot of variation in the population over these types of preferences. So for example, men had less willingness to pay for consistent hours than, say, women. Now, given that people are willing to accept lower earnings to have these characteristics, then you might ask, well, then why aren't employers offering these jobs? And if you think that the market is competitive and that employers are basically aware of this, then the reason is because these types of arrangements do have some cost to employers. It is easier for an employer to be able to say, I can just choose whatever hours necessary as it suits me on any given day. That creates a lot of flexibility for the employer, right? So the fact that there would be, say, a demand for consistent hours is suboptimal to the employer. And that's why these arrangements are not uniform. Now, there's a secondary interesting set of literature on the productivity benefits of these arrangements, which is a little bit different. For working from home, the results are quite mixed. The basic result is that, I would say the basic result in summary is that execution tasks seem to increase in productivity when people work from home. If you know you have to do something, it's a kind of easier environment. Whereas idea creation, coordination, teamwork seems to be better in the office. Crucially, the one thing that is very bad in work from home is onboarding new workers. Young workers did very badly when everybody was at home, because it turns out physical presence is very important for training and mentorship. Okay, so a second set of results, this is also from a paper of mine, is that people really value employment stability. So people, again, looking at people's revealed choices in terms of different jobs, people are willing to pay 20%, accept 20% lower wages to increase the probability that they'll be remaining on the job in 6 months by 10 percentage points. And that points to a fundamental clue on, say, differences between US and Italy, that employment stability seems to be a very valued and important aspect of the job that is not reflected in pay necessarily. What the literature in the US has shown is that if you take all the workplace characteristics that people care about, and I'm talking everything, talking working from home, benefits, but even very intangible things like dignity at work, whether your manager treats you well, that sort of thing. Those characteristics are greater, more than 50% of the overall value of a job. And again, this is pure speculation, but if it's 50% in the US, it doesn't take a huge leap to say that it could be greater in a country like Italy, such that that could considerably close the gap in pay. Again, I don't want to be prescriptive, I don't want to be too confident about that because that requires further study, but that's the kind of thinking that one might do. So that's all I have today, and I thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So thank you so much, not only for keeping the time, but also for having agreed to present with slides in Italian, which I know is not an easy thing to be done. And I have to say, as I said before, but ha tradotto le slide.
He translated the slides. He also sent us a version in Italian, and he's very careful in communication in this sense. I know you have a lot of questions because it's a very controversial topics he has faced. We already have a question, actually. Okay, we have a question.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is about the first case that I found really interesting. And my question is, if we take the aggregate data and it should be like an average of the willingness to pay to decrease the mortality rate in the job, and we take that, and then we extend to a sample of 1,000 individuals, aren't we assuming linearity in the relationship between the willingness to pay for a decrease in the mortality rate? Because I think, like intuitively, from a 1% to a 2% of mortality rate, I'm willing to pay less than from a 99% to 1,000%. And the problem is that with the data we have to rely on the mortality rate for some jobs, and I don't think there is a job with a 99 mortality rate. So how can we overcome that issue, if that is an issue?
Can you hear me on this? Can we turn this mic on? It's on? Okay, that's great. That's a very good question. As you could see in the scatter relationship between occupation and fatalities, even that relationship did not look fully linear. I mean, it was not linear in logs. I don't know what it would look like in levels, but it was not fully linear. So just on the nonlinearity point, that's very relevant. I imagine if you're doing a careful analysis, we would probably start from the baseline fatality rate and find the point on that chart, and then try to use, if we want to be very nuanced, try to use the slope locally just at that point if it is indeed nonlinear. But your question raises some other fundamental points, and I really glossed it over. But this idea that there is one value is actually a bit misleading, because people's preferences are different. Different people have different tolerances for risk. And what these numbers capture is like an average in the population. So there's been other studies that have looked at different contexts. An example is in the US, soldiers enlisting into occupations. And so when the US was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, certain occupations turned out to be much more dangerous because they were combat jobs and they had relatively higher rate of injury and death relative to other, say, desk jobs. And the study tracks who takes which job and then compares it to the various bonuses that people had to be offered to take those jobs to quantify for these soldiers what was their implied value of life. It turns out that they got a lower number than that $9 million. And you might say that lower number is a reflection of what we call selection, self-selection and sorting, that the people who sort and select into becoming soldiers tend to be less risk averse than people in the general population. And so that's another example where one has to take some care about how these numbers could vary depending on the context.
As you have been making this example of the risk at work, let me take the opportunity of being introducing you to ask you a question that is very relevant for Italy, because we have a record of work injuries which is extremely high, and therefore we always try to find good measure to reduce the number of work accidents. So clearly everybody implicitly has a notion of a fact that there is a risk of working. It's not because just also commuting from home to work envisage some risk. And indeed, as a matter of fact, a lot of work injuries occur in the transit from home to work. But generally, workers may have a wrong perception of the extent of this risk. And it's very difficult for people to get a good understanding of this type of things. And so this information is more on the side of employer often than on the side of a worker. So we were to conclude from the type of trade-off and wage increases that workers ask to get compensated for this high risk, we may seriously underestimate
So the idea that wages reflect risk fundamentally implies that there is some common knowledge about the levels of risk. Now, as you say, if that knowledge is imperfect, then that relationship in principle would be attenuated, and we might expect a value of statistical life that's even higher than what is implied by such figures. There's one nuance, which is that, and I'd be interested in knowing what is the case in Italy, but in certain places in the US, employers can be sued if there's a workplace accident. And so they have full liability. If they have full liability, then it is in their interest to adjust wages. It's their interest to have as safe as possible workplaces, independent of worker knowledge. Now, if in other places in the US that's not the case, there's like a benefit structure, in which case that's no longer true.
So,
Buongiorno a tutti. Io understand. I speak in Italian because ho avuto un'operazione, parlo anche in inglese.
I will speak Italian to ask this question. I will speak Italian because you can listen to the translation into English. So I'm an expert of the Italian Ministry of Culture, and I think it's interesting because I've moved 9 times. I've lived in several areas of Turin. And from your presentation, we saw that the definition of the cost of houses, I've seen it changed in several areas in Turin. And, for example, you showed that the environmental element is important. Living downtown is implies very high costs. And the regulation about the access of vehicles is very strict downtown, and so there is an effect indeed. The heating systems also have an impact on pollution. I've also been in the States, in New York. I believe it's more or less the same. Whereas in London, most of the people live not downtown, but in the outskirts. I've seen terrible conditions in South America, Venezuela, Mexico. The situation is terrible. Pollution levels are very, very high. So what do you think in this regard? Well, and congratulations for your presentation, by the way.
un sacco di dati nella sua esistenza, questo signore.
He's gathered a lot of data in his existence, in his life.
Yes, we should interview you and use you as a basis of our study. Yes, so there's...
Yes, I'm an expert. I'm an expert. I've studied a lot.
So, yes, there's a lot of variation in pollution levels, both within cities and across cities. And in your discussion, that's clearly, one thing that clearly emerges is that these differences in pollution are also correlated with many other things, whether it's downtown, income levels, certain, and so on. So the very nice thing about the work that's been done in the area of pollution and housing prices is that it effectively tries to control for as many other factors as possible to just isolate that. So in the context of Turin, these relationships would imply that if the air quality is worse downtown, that by itself would contribute to depreciation of the housing values downtown, holding everything else constant with the understanding that downtown has many other things relative to other areas. Now, when it comes to other countries, that's a difficult question because the willingness to pay measures that have been calculated, say, in the US, which are the ones I've cited, may be different than the willingness to pay measures for cleaner air in, say, Mexico City. The willingness to pay measures that we have from the US would tell you how an American would value a reduction, would value a reduction. And it's possible that the reason that air quality is much worse in some parts is because there's an income relationship between how much you value clean air and your baseline level of income, such that in Mexico, there are other priorities such as, so here is just one story from my own family. My mother's side of the family was from Chile, and they lived in Santiago, which is like here. It's surrounded by mountains and very dirty. And they were telling me back in the day, this is when Allende was elected, his campaign platform was, "We will turn the sky black with smoke," which was because of all the industry that we're going to have. That was the slogan. You can't imagine that being the slogan today.
I don't think so. L'ultima domanda, perché poi dobbiamo chiudere.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture. I want to go back to the argument made about linear relationship, actually, because it was something that I was thinking too. And my question for you is actually, does it make sense to give the same value to a life as it does to give the value of not losing a life? In the sense that the argument that was made about linear relationship, I was thinking that in the sense that losing one life for 100,000 times, it's different than losing in one moment 100,000 lives, because the effect on also those that stay in life is actually different. So would it make sense in that sense, considering also some non-linear relationships and the timing also?
Yes.
Thank you.
And it comes down to fundamentally where the measures come from. So when we looked at the relations between workplace risk and wages, that's more like what you said, which was losing one life, right? Workplace risk is a fairly isolated event. And so that may not be exactly correct measure for an event where, like COVID, where all of a sudden 100,000 lives are lost, which unfortunately we don't have, fortunately, we don't have too many kind of natural experiments like that, although COVID itself may be such a natural experiment in that I don't think that the policies that were taken in COVID were explicitly based on these value of life calculations. The policies were just done, and in some sense they reflect how society as a whole valued the possibility of losing 100,000 or more lives, and the fact that these measures are taken with such a big impact on GDP suggests that, maybe gives us some information about that. So that's a and there's other nuances as well. If you like the nature, I don't want to get too morbid, but the nature of whether it's somebody who's younger versus older, whether it's an accident versus cancer, all of that could be relevant.
Grazie anche per queste domande, davvero la bellezza del Festival di Torino.
Well, thank you for your questions. Truly an important, fundamental part of this festival. Thank you so much. Alexander, he mentioned Charles Jones for his studies on issues similar to these ones. Tomorrow he will speak at 10:30 here at Collegio, so please do come to follow his lecture as well. Very promising. Enjoy your evening.